Thank you for the welcome. I want to start by, on behalf of Ammon and myself, to thank the SMS and the committee who selected us and our paper for the Best Paper Award. We are deeply honored by this. If one has a look at the list of previous recipients of this prize, it's very humbling, and in a sense, we feel that we don't belong to this list. Nevertheless, it's a great honor to have received the prize. So thanks. So to sort of facilitate this session, so we decided that we would do basically three things. We would recap a little bit about what this 2006 paper was all about, the background of it. We'll talk about why we think that this paper became influential, how it has led to us to focus on some unresolved puzzles, and this in turn gives rise to some future research opportunities that we will talk about towards the end. But let me share my screen and start the presentation. Now it should be in full mode. So what's the paper really about? The framing of the paper first. The paper takes as its point of the departure open innovation, and actually Ammon had gotten a copy of Henry Chesebro's 2003 big book the year before it was published, and when we were still working on a working paper. And Ammon had first met Henry Chesebro at the CCC at MIT in 1996. So we were sort of, for this reason, at the forefront of what went on. We had access to this book, and we thought, well, we're doing some work that's along these lines. Why don't we connect to this work? We had sort of a belief already at that time that that book would become influential, and that prediction certainly turned out to be true. We also based it on the work by Ahuja and Katila that had appeared in Academy of Management Journal, some other related work in SMJ about the search for innovation, basically conceptualizing the path that leads to innovation as search. We followed the literature on external knowledge inputs and absorptive capacity, that sort of literature, and thought that these, or argued that these benefits that would accrue from being connected to external sources, that they would be subject to decreasing returns. In subsequent sections of the paper, we nested the paper in the both the let's say North American-based innovation literature, but also in the European one. Went into detail with open innovation, into detail with the search literature, and claimed some novelty. That is that we paid explicit attention to external search channels as opposed to internal search channels that had been researched more in previous literature before. And we also claimed that we would focus more directly on innovation, that is invention with a commercial application, as opposed to patent data that is may only be linked to commercial applications in certain settings. So we claimed that we had some data that could speak more in general to this issue. And we looked at variation between different types of innovation, the different types of radicalness, we call it, or perhaps it's more accurately described as different degrees of novelty. The potential external search channels that we considered, they could be customers, suppliers, competitors, consultants, universities, government research institutes, conference, and various standards. There had been research on these sources of innovation. I can just mention Eric von Hippel's 1988 book that's called The Sources of Innovation. So it was not completely new in this sense, but to look sort of at the overall the overall search pattern of firms in terms of external sources, we claimed was new. And we also argued that each of these sources, or rather search channels, can be considered as separate search spaces that encompasses different institutional norms, habits, and rules, and that may in each case require organizational practices adopted particular to those search channels, and in effect that this is a costly thing to engage with for an organization. So each search channel requires significant investment. You can see here is a sort of business school types and then a lab, and obviously there are some people in firms who are commercially oriented. They may sometimes have to work with people with a more academic inclination. We know from the literature that this is possible, but a translation, so to speak, is needed, and this it is costly. So at the outset, it is not just easy for these people to collaborate because they come with different norms and are under different institutional settings. They need to invest on each side in understanding the other one to benefit from it. So in terms of openness in general, we followed the literature and says, well, there are definitely benefits from being open. You get access to sticky knowledge, that is knowledge that is accumulated in another sphere through experience and is difficult to transfer. And related to this is that a diverse set of external knowledge sources allows for more knowledge recombination. So to speak, if you have several sources as opposed to just one or a couple, then there's more opportunity for recombination. But there are also costs associated with this. And that's something that we were considering already, that when we started engaging with open innovation, that is, well, open innovation may be a good thing, but nothing grows directly into heaven. So there's going to be some cost associated with that. So we were rather focused on that. And one idea here is that firms only have so much managerial attention that they can allocate. So they may extend themselves too far and not be able to capture the external ideas and to transform this into innovation. So there may be too many ideas for the firm to manage and choose between. We call that the absorptive capacity problem. Many innovative ideas come at the wrong time and in the wrong place to be fully exploited. And if there are really many of these, this probability increases. So that's the timing problem. And since there are so many ideas, few of these ideas are taken seriously or given the right level of attention to transform them into something economically useful. So that's what we refer to as the attention allocation problem. And we know from the attention literature, the attention allocation literature by Ocasio and others, that if you don't pay attention, things don't work out so well. So this can this lack of attention can lead firms to engage with too many, or in fact also too few sources of innovation or external search channels. We focused on two types of external search. One is external search breadth, simply how many uses do the firms, how many channels do the firms use? And the second one is the depth, that is the intensity of that use. So how important is it really? Is it very important to you? Then that is the intensity. So the main hypothesis, very briefly, so external search breadth is related to innovative performance in an inverse U-shaped fashion. The same we posit for external search depth, again the inverted U-shape. We also argued that the more the radical innovation, the less effective external search breadth will be on innovative performance, and the more radical the innovation, the more effective external search depth will be. And I don't want to go into too many details of the mechanisms. I don't have time for this here, but that is just to say that for more radical innovation, the deep interaction with a particular source is more important than the breadth that we would sort of say that's important for the fine-tuning of an innovation before it's introduced to the market. So that's sort of the quick version of this of these two hypotheses. And then finally, the R&D intensity of firms is complementary to external search breadth and depth in shaping innovative performance. So that is basically the more R&D you invest in, the better you can exploit external knowledge. That is also known as the absorptive capacity hypothesis. So we also tested that. We used a source of data that had not been used so much in management research, actually had been mainly used in research by economists, but also well, actually in famous journals such as American Economic Review. A couple of papers there had been published at this point. It was in management science, as well as I recall. But in sort of mainstream management, this data had not been used. So some effort of our paper was to describe this data the way that one usually does within the field of management. We looked at about 2,700 manufacturing firms across 13 broad industries in our sample of UK firms. We also had R&D data, sourcing data, many different control variables, and our explanatory variables involved 16 external sources of innovation. And the general question was this one: how important to your enterprise's innovation activities during the 3-year period 1998 to 2000 were each of the following information and knowledge sources? And then they come 17 in total. One is internal. We excluded that and focused on the 16 external on the survey. We looked at, as a dependent variable, we looked at innovation performance in terms of innovations that were new to the market of the firm, called that in-world, innovations that were new to the firm, or improved products or services. And then the breadth, simply a count of the 16 sources, whether they were used or not. And then depth is a count of the 16 sources, whether they are used to a high degree or not. And it'll turn out that the firms tick this box much more rarely than the former, but by definition, but they're far from identical. If we look at the different sources, some descriptives, clients or customers, 66% of firms responded, in our sample, responded that they use this to various degrees. This can be contrasted to universities or other higher education institutes, where only 27% indicated the use of innovation. And I will skip the regression tables and so on, just show you the inverted U shapes. So what we found is that for breadth, the optimal level of sources, if you like, was 11. So the answer to the big question is 11. That's the optimal amount of external knowledge sources. After that, there are decreasing returns. And we spent quite a lot of time on actually detecting whether the curve is really bending according to the data, and that was confirmed. If we look at the depth, then it's the curve starts bending much earlier. That's around 3 sources. So the model predicts that around 3 sources that you work with in an intense way, or that you rate highly, then the curve starts to swing really rapidly. So already out there at around 5 sources, you don't have you really have very negative benefits. For the last hypothesis, we find the hypothesis confirmed as well. So for breadth, you can say it's more important for less radical or incremental innovation, if you like, and the depth plays a bigger role when it comes to the products and services that are new to the world. So we get this idea that if you want to do something that is more novel, you need to focus on fewer sources. It could, for instance, be a university. If there's something that's truly new, I think of biotech, for instance. Probably that in that case, it's a university and a few other things. Whereas if we consider something that's more developed, it's beneficial to use more sources. The final part had to do with absorptive capacity. Actually, here we did not find the hypothesis confirmed. No matter what we did, you can say the interaction between R&D spending and openness turned out to be negative. So there's sort of there's a substitution effect there, if you like, and we interpreted this in the paper as a not invented here syndrome, that if you have very large expenditure on internal R&D, it seems more likely that you will reject ideas from the outside. So maybe this can be interpreted as you need some absorptive capacity to absorb external knowledge, but at the margin, external knowledge sources and internal R&D are substitutes. So here I'll hand it over to Ammon. I'll continue to run the slides. So Ammon, you just have to indicate when you want them changed.
Okay, thanks, Keld. I think what we wanted to do in this part of the presentation is give a little sense of where the paper came from, and also, why it's been influential. Just to start out, when we first developed the paper, we took it on the road. We went to many different conferences and got suggestions from different colleagues about how to develop the work, published the paper, and then over the last 15 years or so, we've just seen a lot of citations fall on us like a gift from heaven. So since the paper was published, it's the third most cited paper in SMJ since 2000, and the 12th most cited in Scopus over the life of strategic management journals. So it's had a major following. And of course, there's been lots of really great papers which have extended and replicated and tried different things with this type of data in good journals. Keld? So we've seen over time the paper's influence has increased, and it's kind of spread and doubled in influence every couple of years. And there's some signs of plateauing of influence, but it's plateauing at a very high level. And the paper's become a kind of cornerstone citation for many people working in this area. Sometimes the paper is cited for things we never said, which is always an interesting social phenomenon. It's when your paper becomes embedded as a sort of reflex citation, then sometimes the citations differ a little from the contribution, but we'll take all the citations. We're not proud. Keld? So we've been thinking about this, Keld and I, over the years about why this paper generated so much attention. We did other papers at the same time. We worked on different topics. And so if we go trying to think about why this paper had the influence that it's had, I think one aspect was the timeliness of the work. We were kind of early adopters of the open innovation language. And as Henry Chesborough said some years ago, it was a paper that provided sort of early and compelling evidence for the phenomena of open innovation. So Henry's book was, largely based on case studies, and those are very valuable, but to provide some sort of survey level data on this topic was an important spur for other researchers. The other issue, of course, is that, in the study of innovation, for a long time we've known that external sources of knowledge are important for the innovation process, and that firms rely on these external sources quite heavily. But the effect of use of those external sources on innovation, innovative output, had not been fully demonstrated. So it fit into a tradition of research that came before us and extended it in a different direction. The other thing I think which has been really important for the paper is the data. So CIS data, which stands for Community Innovation Survey, was sort of innovated in the early 1990s as a sort of public policy measure to try to measure innovation across the economic system. It diffused across the EU. It became standardized in the CIS and also in other countries. When we first started working with this data in the 1990s, at first I did, there was almost only exclusively done by economists and policy researchers. There wasn't anybody looking at sort of managerial questions with this data. So we tried to, try to tell the story of this data as useful for management scholars. And so part of the effort in the paper is to try to reframe this data as something which involves a degree of managerial action and behavior, as opposed to something that just affects public policy or spillovers. And so part of this was creating a sort of new language to talk about some of the variables. So instead of talking about the information sources question on the survey as a measure of spillovers, we called it a measure of search. And just that, reframing of the information helped to kind of spur a lot of attention and interest from other scholars. The other thing that's helped is the CIS data is widely available. So many people have this data. It's allowed for lots of follow-up studies and extensions and replications. It's a very cumulative field, and CIS data has diffused everywhere. And so that makes it easier for people to get hold of this data and do their own type of analysis. Another aspect of the paper, I think, is which Keld presented, is we had a bit of theory and we had some predictions and some evidence. So it's a nice combination of sort of different elements in a paper that come together. I think there's also an element of just pure dumb luck in the research game. You publish a paper, you have no idea what influence it will have, and then all of a sudden, opportunities and recognition come your way. So the Matthew effect is very strong in science, and we've benefited greatly from the Matthew effect. So I think one thing to ask to notice about the work a little bit is the kind of effort and care that was put into the empirical work at the time. These days it wouldn't meet the standards for endogeneity in a modern SMJ paper, but at the time we used what we could as sort of best practice, and we spent a lot of time on the U shape, both trying to understand it theoretically and trying to explain the mechanisms on different sides of the curve, and also to empirically test for whether or not we had decreasing or negative returns. In fact, the test for negative returns we got from a seminar, and it was a comment by Brownman Hall, who made a comment during one of our presentations about how to test for this. So she gave us the idea for exactly how to test for a negative effect. And years later, somebody noticed that we did this when many other papers that looked at these sort of curvilinear relationships did not. And so we're very grateful to Brownman for her advice and support in seminars. I think that's one thing to know about these kinds of projects. You really get a lot out of early presentations and comments from senior colleagues. Okay, Kel. Yeah, so just how we found each other, so to speak, as collaborators. We first met at a PhD away day. So I traveled to northern Denmark, spent a couple days at a workshop, and I got to know Keld there. And we struck up a collaboration when I was a postdoc at SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex, where Keld had done his master's degree before I got there. And we had sort of common ancestors, if you will, common lineage, although we'd never been at the same institution working or studying together. We just met up at one of these events, and we found a very easy pattern of collaboration. Okay, Kel. So the way we got started really was doing a paper on university industry collaborations. That was the first project. I had done a sort of little dirty regression and came over to Copenhagen to present it. And then I invited Keld to join me on the project, and we upgraded the work. And we tried to write a sort of management paper. We had no experience in the area of management research. I came from a public policy institute. Keld came from a sort of backwoods economics department at the University of Aalborg, doing great work, but well outside the mainstream. And we had to kind of retool ourselves to write in the template of management articles. So that was part of our learning and training. And we got our first papers rejected, but we learned from that and learned how to write in the template. So the original idea was, when we were doing this university industry paper, we said, well, why don't we write a performance paper? And we had this discussion about what we should do this. And so we had this little conversation between us, and that eventually led to this project. And when we got started with the project, we were thinking, okay, so what are the costs and benefits? I mean, I had done a lot of work on university industry collaboration and was aware that it's not easy to work with universities. And so, what are the costs to the firm in trying to go out and get external knowledge? And that was always in our mind's eye as we developed the project. And of course, we were influenced by Chesborough's book, which is a very evocative and powerful term. So after the Laursen and Salter experience, we did some other projects as part of our program of research on this topic area. We did a project on so-called paradox of innovation, which we managed to get published 8 years after we did the original draft. So it was a hard slog. We also did a project on appropriability and innovation, which we managed never to publish. We tried very hard, but failed at every turn, and we eventually gave up. And so that's one of the sort of what do they say, file drawer projects. We've seen over the years that CIS data has become increasingly accepted by other scholars. Originally, when we started doing this work, there was a lot of skepticism about this data, and now there's been kind of gradual adoption and reuse. Although for many scholars working in innovation technology, it's still seen as second best to patent data. I'm not sure why, but they still consider it as second best. The other thing is the CIS is diffused all over the world. It's a bit like COVID. It's very contagious. So every country's adopted CIS, and you see international agencies incorporate this, and even economists take it as useful data. Data finds theory, and theory finds data, and so there's been lots of work using this information. And there's been lots of great papers which have tried to build on Laursen and Salter and take it in new and different directions, combining CS data with lots of other sources of information. So that's potentially a great source of novelty, of recombination. And over the time that Keld and I have sort of in the post-Laursen and Salter 2006 era, we've tried to break away from the straitjacket of the CIS. We both made conscious decisions not to do too many CIS papers. We were mainlining CIS data for a few years, And after a while, we realized that's kind of a limiting factor in our own research trajectories. And we branched into new areas, looked at different topics. And that
using
was
patent data.
Yeah, went back to patent data. So that was a spur for us to find new subjects, keep our level of interest in our own research high. So in terms of the two of us, I think we have fairly complementary skill sets. We love to argue. We don't always agree with each other. Keld can be very stubborn. I'm always right, unfortunately. And we have these good argy-bargy discussions. That's part of and we enjoy working with each other, and the creative abrasion of our two styles of working and our differences in cultural backgrounds is really important for how we successfully collaborate. Okay, Keld.
Okay, then we will move to some of the unresolved problems that is sort of evolved out of our work. So one thing that I already alluded to, that's all the absorptive capacity problem. The absorptive capacity, the ability of firms to recognize the value of new external information as assimilated and applied to a commercial ends. That's from the very beginning of the most cited paper in innovation studies. That's the paper by Cohen and Leventhaler on absorptive capacity. So arguably, we knew this paper very well when we did this research. Probably we could even cite stuff from it without reading it. And we very strongly believe in the message of this, that you need to invest to benefit. I think that comes out of the Sprue tradition, but it also comes out of some of the other founding fathers of innovation studies, for Dick Nelson, Sid Winter, Wes Cohen, and so on. So we are playing with a variable that we have a lot of. Love is maybe a too strong word, but we definitely, it's a variable that we like very much. But we didn't quite find that when we're doing the research. It's kind of obvious that firms who invest more in internal R&D, that they should benefit more also from external knowledge sourcing. But there is an inbuilt tension here, because if one goes back and read the 2003 book by Chesbrough, which we have also read very well, then actually the main argument there is that the benefits from internal R&D are not disappearing, but they are declining. And so there you have sort of a trade-off. So less R&D, more external sourcing or more external search, because of some disadvantages that are emerging within the R&D system. So there's a tension there that was somehow unresolved, and I'm also sure that our paper didn't really resolve that tension. In fact, we found a negative interaction between the level of R&D spending and the number of external sources, and because of this. Let's call it affinity for absorptive capacity. I tell you, I did everything I could to make that result disappear, but it's there. So no matter how you torture the data, then that sign remains negative. So it didn't involve any p-hacking to get it, but it raises some questions. While at the same time, other research found that, for instance, R&D and in-licensing, and another source of external knowledge use, that they are neither complements nor substitutes. So there's a sort of no definite answer to this. I wouldn't call it a paradox, but it's an unresolved issue. So it may be that some level of R&D is most often a precondition for successful external knowledge sourcing, but that it's not monotonically increasing with the level of external knowledge used. So there might be some minimum amount of R&D that you used. I presented this at Duke once in honor of Wes Cohen, and he said that they had actually never thought that it should be monotonically increasing, but of course it remains to be specified how that precise relationship should work out. So there is an opportunity there to come up perhaps with a different types of angle, a different theory and so on, that could sort of try to grapple with that issue and come up with more definitive answers in that regard. Another puzzle has to do with what we have referred to as the paradox of openness. So what is the relationship between the focus on appropriability, protecting innovation, and openness? To be able to engage in open relations, it's often needed to have some IP. There's a paper by Gans and Stern that makes this point very clearly, that you need protection to engage in barter and exchange and so on. That's an easy case to follow, but if you do it too much, perhaps then it's more difficult to be open, because the internal processes will lead you to focus on protection as opposed to openness. And a very strong emphasis on appropriability may also scare collaborators away. So despite research efforts, we have also tried to address this issue of this relation. Then we believe that this is sort of unresolved. We have a few ideas of what could connect this, but it's not, we really know very little about the managerial practices and other contingencies that allows firm to address this particular challenge of how you balance the paradox of openness. So how do firms maneuver these challenges? Do they have to do zigzagging, being open, being closed? Do they need to pursue parallel strategies at the same time? One focused more on openness, while the other one is more focused on appropriability. Stealth mode in the beginning that then changes into appropriability. Community models where you make the incentives work for you and so on. There are many possibilities here. So the issue is that we still don't know, basically. And another intriguing issue is this idea whether open firms are firms that are there, that are sort of basically prey on the prairie, ready to be exploited by other firms. So that's another issue that we think has been underexplored. Final unresolved puzzle pertains to a paper that, or an issue that Ammon and I addressed in a recent paper in the Strategic Management Review. Who benefits from open innovation, the firm or its employees? So the issue is that, yes, it may be, as we find evidence consistent with, that it's beneficial for firms to engage in open innovation, but the benefits from that may not accrue to the firm alone. Under certain conditions, it may have to be shared with other stakeholders, in particular the employees of the firm. And this project began with Ammon's visit at 3M, where he saw a sign saying, "Be loyal, protect 3M's interests, assets, and information. 3M's reputation and its success are built on the loyalty of its people who put interest first when doing their jobs, who do not allow personal activities to conflict with 3M's business, as who carefully protects 3M's information, assets, and interests." So that's a very interesting statement, because if you think people are loyal, you probably don't need to put up a sign in the hallway saying that you need to be loyal. So that illustrates that perhaps is an issue. There are firms that they may not have interest that's aligned with their interest, at least not in all cases. So there's a bargaining power issue here, and in this paper I alluded to before, we speculate that this could have to do with some of the characteristics of the knowledge involved and of the tightness of the appropriation regime. And we basically argue that if you have very low specificity of your knowledge and you have a weak appropriation regime, well, then the returns will go to the employee. On the other hand, very specific, firm-specific knowledge and strong appropriation regime, it's a given that the firm will benefit. And then the two other cases are sort of mixed. And then in addition to that, we try to, well, we follow the T's paper in its spirit and try to come up with some recommendations for what firms can do under these conditions. New departures, Ammon.
Yeah, so in this section, we just want to talk about where the research field is going and the world of practice. I think in our own mind, we've seen an explosion of interest in open innovation, lots of experimentation in the private sector and in the public sector. So we've seen all sorts of attempts by large firms to open up their innovation practices. We've seen a lot of entrepreneurial effort with respect to open innovation, lots of facilities, incubators, lots of different mechanisms, institutional forms that have evolved to try to take this advantage of the big firm opening up and the young firm wishing to collaborate. We've also seen the repurposing of R&D labs, rebadging themselves as units of open innovation. getting staff away from the sort of focus on invention production towards being more hunters of external ideas, gatekeepers and shepherds of external ideas coming into the firm. So this is speaking to the sort of roles that people take up under the open innovation mantle. We've also seen companies, reimagine their asset portfolio, seeing themselves as vehicles for exploitation as opposed to exploration, or vehicles for exploration, trying to, let other organizations use the assets they have available. And then we've seen some rethinking of IP, with model contracts, dialing back the bargaining power advantages, trying to focus on future benefits as opposed to getting stuck in the weeds with trying to write long contracts for incomplete information. So there's been some experimentation around IP and new models of IP, which have been developed to try to enable more external collaboration. We've also seen changes in the way the division of labor for innovation takes place. We've seen more specialist knowledge emerge outside the firm, and therefore, the opportunities for a firm to buy in external knowledge has increased. There's more modular forms of knowledge where you can find opportunities and skilled labor from outside the firm and no longer have to possess this yourself. And then, of course, we've seen a qualitative reduction in the coordination costs that are necessary, that you have to pay in order to get access to knowledge and to work with other parties. So, all of these things have happened over the last 15 years, and this has really sort of filled the tub for open innovation, leading to a lot of practice experimentation and lots of different activities, which are, a great space for researchers like ourselves and others to kind of explore. Next slide. I mean, the issue with open innovation in terms of the last sort of 15 years of practice, I think you can say this with some degree of confidence, is a little bit of wolves in sheep's clothing. There's a lot of big firms who claim to be very open, but when you actually, look at the real lived experience of those who have to try to collaborate with them, it's, not very pleasant. So, there's a lot of goodwill and hot air about open innovation by private interests, which actually doesn't translate into successful partnerships. And there's been a lot of bad experience on both sides of this relationship. And I think one of the challenges here is a mismatch between expectations and ways of working between the two parties. So, large firms still operate in sort of the iron cage of their templates, their categories, their ways of thinking about problems, and they have a very different notion of risk and reward profiles. Sometimes, of course, the bargaining power can be on the other foot. We've seen this with the BioNTech and Pfizer collaboration, the 50-50 partnership that developed the mRNA vaccine. That was hugely successful. That's probably one of the most successful cases of open innovation collaboration in recent years. And that was a case where the sort of large firm, small firm were able to find a good way of working. They had previously collaborated, so that was one advantage they had. They understood and knew each other already. So, you also get these tensions within firms between different parts of the firm and their desires to be open, and other parts of the firm which desire a more closed model. So open innovation within a firm is not a single thing. There's different types of open innovation within the same firm. And this is something that, we need to explore and understand better in the future. The other thing we see a lot in these open innovation communities and innovation practices is a kind of insider outsider structure with winner take all type of dynamics. And so we have these questions about ownership and control. A lot of things start open and then become closed. Some things start closed and become open. And there's interesting issues about who controls the decision making, the rights over different assets as these different as these systems evolve. And we've seen a lot in the last 5 to 7 years, the growth of these very powerful platforms, what Ron Ander called ecosystems as opposed to ecosystems. These are very powerful actors who control a lot of resources, control the platform in a way which benefits themselves as opposed to other communities. They use the platform to extract value from others who may have a slightly different mode of operandi, and they can be very capricious. They can arbitrarily change the rules to their own benefits. They can use opportunistic decision-making. All of this is a threat to the process of creative destruction and open innovation, which has come forward in the last few years. So this is a question about how we sort of manage the platforms as a potential a violent overthrow of the opportunities of open innovation. Okay, that's it from me, Kel. This is just a picture of the two of us back after we just finished submitting the first round to SMJ. We went out for a beer in London and South Kensington, and this is us enjoying the fruits of early labor. We're happy to take any questions or comments that people have. We can look at the chat now and try to pick up on anything anyone has any interests in. So there is a question about CIS data for North American manufacturers. So as I understand, I'm not an expert in this area, as I understand the United States through the National Science Board has included some CIS questions in the R&D survey. So it should be possible to access sort of CIS-like information for US firms. And of course, Ashish Arora has conducted several studies from Duke where he's done sort of CIS-like surveys in the US context. So, and John Walsh as well. So there is some American data, which now looks very CIS-like, something that wasn't the case when Keld and I did our study.
This question also came in the Q&A. They ask, why is in-house R&D not mentioned as a source of innovation? Several innovations come from in-house R&D.
Right, I can take that one. So we definitely share this opinion, and we also do have R&D in our paper, and it also explains innovation to a large degree. So in this sense, yes, absolutely, R&D remains an important factor. The question is, how does it play together with open source? So we sort of wanted to add the complementary view that open innovation matters as well. I think that, reflecting on this, I think one could open up the black box of the firm to a higher degree. I mean, so one thing is to have R&D, which would reflect sort of all this internal search efforts in as far as it's reflected in costs of having an R&D department, what Dick Nelson refers to as offline search. But actually, also from inside firms, knowledge sources can sort of emerge in many different places. It can be internal, they can be central R&D. Yes, that's one possibility. But also business units often do search. It can also be people who are not who are only working with the innovation as sort of their secondary task, maybe more in touch with external actors that can come up with ideas. So talking a little bit about straitjackets again, then on the CIS, the focus is clearly on external sources, whereas the number of internal sources are rather limited. So I think there's an opportunity for future research. In fact, I'm working a little bit on some of these ideas in a project with some collaborators. So maybe something more will come out about that. But I think one thing has to do with the survey designs, that it doesn't really unpack what goes on inside firms.
I think there's another issue here is that, a lot of external knowledge in the end has to be made internal. So, to take an external knowledge idea or concept or tool, whatever, and you have to domesticate it. So it has to be translated into the categories of the firm and the templates of the firm. There's a process of assimilation that is required to enable external knowledge to be used. In a later paper I did with Anna Terwal and Paula Criscuolo, we looked at sort of the making of the marriage, if you will, between the external knowledge and the internal knowledge. And, it's really this process of assimilation. So do you have people who are skilled at both finding external knowledge and then assimilating that external knowledge in a way it can be utilized inside the firm? So a lot of the effort of open innovation is really, the assimilation role that people in R&D take up as sort of vehicles or handmaidens of external ideas for internal use. And I think that's something we've got a little sense of. There's some good papers on assimilation, including Felipe Montero's work with Julian Birkinshaw, but there's much more work to be done on understanding the sort of internal face of open innovation.
This question comes in from Christina. She asks, do you think that longitudinal studies can help to address some of the unresolved puzzles? For example, the relation between absorptive capacity and open innovation.
I think the short answer is a yes. I think we need longitudinal data and to study this also from the time perspective, which was not something we did back in the day when we wrote this paper. But perhaps one can even do more than that, just sort of get the relationships confirmed, because we were talking about doing things whether you shift mode in terms of research, whether you in some periods are more internally focused, whereas in other times you're more externally focused. So I think if you have data that's deep enough time-wise, then it's very, very promising to examine shifts in this. Rita Katila has a paper in ASQ that sort of looks at whether firms search in sync or not. But I think this type of research where you look at how things change over time, and in that sense take time seriously, I think that is a one very important way to go. And the good news is that we are getting more and more data available also over time.
Yeah, the other angle to look at this is at the different levels. So, open innovation was originally developed as a firm level construct, but of course it could be applied to projects or to individuals, or even for decision-making processes. So, one thing is to look at sort of open innovation at the different levels, to kind of imagine a Coleman's bucket, if you will, where you have the firm goes for open innovation, then it cascades down into the organization where individuals and project teams take up the open innovation challenge, and then that comes back up as an organizational practice that we can see and observe. So, this sort of multi-level understanding of open innovation, theoretically, empirically, over time, those are really interesting questions that people need to grapple with. And the CIS is helpful, but you're going to need a lot of other information to say something interesting about that.
I just want to remind folks that if you do have questions or comments, feel free to submit them either in the chat or the Q&A. I guess any other closing comments from Ammon or Keld here?
Yeah, I just said it's been very enjoyable to be able to talk about an old paper, which is something that we rarely do, and reflect on how it came about and how it evolved and so on. And then it's another opportunity to work with Ammon, which is always a pleasure. And again, thanks to the SMS and the committee for selecting us. We're deeply honored by receiving the prize.
Yeah, I just wanted to second what Keld well said, and also to encourage people to kind of find new data. One of the things about this project was to access some interesting new data. I think that our field needs novelty in terms of information sources, and we can't just keep banging our heads against the patent wall hoping to yield some new information. We need to combine what we know and what we understand with new information from other places, and try to find, unlock the key, if you will, with these different complementary pieces of information. So I would encourage people to really be creative in terms of finding new data sources. And, it's going to be difficult. People will reject your papers. They'll say it's not trustworthy, it's not reliable, we don't know it as well as we know other forms of information. But, I think it's worthwhile to be persistent.
All right. Well, on that lovely note, thank you both so much. And thanks to everybody who tuned in and watched. If you missed some portion of this, we did record it and it will be posted on the YouTube channel sometime, hopefully later today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.